There's no point denying this, no beating around the bush. I am a member of that famous inner city elite. A homeowner on the CBD fringe, I work in the creative knowledge industries, I ride a bike, I've got a productive garden, the full catastrophe. That might be you too, or maybe not. Now, in this age of divides, this is a biggie. And it's all sketched out in our urban geography. Now, meet Richard Florida. He's author of The New Urban Crisis, long subtitle, How Our Cities Are Increasing Inequality, Deepening Segregation and Failing the Middle Class, and what we can do about it. He joins us via Skype from Toronto. Richard, welcome.
It's great to be with you.
I wonder if it was people like me you had in mind with the Back to the City movement thing you wrote about in the rise of the creative class in 2002.
No, it was actually you. I really did. I imagined you like this radio guy who lives near the downtown core, rides a bike, and I was like, it's him. It's definitely
that guy.
Him. But it's really funny in reflecting on this. It's hard to believe it's been 15 years. And I think, you reflect, you grow a little older, and I think for all of the people like you, I think I sorely underpredicted. People say, what did you get wrong? What did you get right? I think I got a lot of things right. I think there is a creative class. I think it was urban oriented. I think I just massively underpredicted how much, to what degree this group of people, these scientists, techies, managers, designers, artists, and so on and so forth, would come crashing back to the cities. And, not just Melbourne and that other city, Sydney and Toronto and Vancouver in Canada, and New York and San Francisco and Seattle and Boston in the States. These cities I never predicted, like Pittsburgh, where I was living at the time, or Detroit, Michigan, where my wife is from, or Newark, New Jersey. I mean, as strange as it sounds, a city that was completely emptied of industry and people when they moved to the suburbs. Now I'm meeting young people who are saying, it's too affordable in New York or Brooklyn or Manhattan or Brooklyn. I'm going to move to Newark. And, even companies like Audible, established its headquarters there. So I think I'm really quite surprised. I was quite surprised by the ferocity of the urban revival.
Well, and that is a thing that's happened, but it's created this centralisation of affluence around the most desirable urban centres.
Welcome to Melbourne. I just looked at the most affordable
to New York.
Yeah, but it's really interesting. New York is in dire straits of its own, but at a metropolitan region, I'll go to New York in a second, Melbourne and Sydney and Toronto and Vancouver, along with Hong Kong, are on an income to housing cost basis. Maybe you can get a flat in Melbourne for less than you can in Manhattan, but the incomes aren't as high. On an income to housing cost basis, they're extraordinarily expensive. So the point is, these very successful, very desirable cities like Melbourne, like Sydney, like Vancouver, like Toronto, and also like San Francisco and New York and Los Angeles, Boston and D.C., have become so highly sought after, they've become increasingly unaffordable to anyone but the rich or anyone who had bought a house many years ago and saw the house appreciate. And in addition to that, as a consequence of the fact that the land is so highly sought after, they've become increasingly unequal, not just unequal in terms of rich and poor. What's really troubling is the most interesting, the most diverse, the most creative, the more tech-oriented cities, the densest cities, have also become the most economically segregated in that you have these areas of concentrated affluence, in the city, but also certainly in Australia or Canada, big countries that are not so populated. Also, you have wealthy areas in the suburbs, but these wealthy areas in the cities and suburbs are just surrounded by, areas of concentrated disadvantage. And I think that's really the new urban crisis in a nutshell. The middle class has declined, the middle class neighborhoods have declined, and we've divided into both urban and suburban patchwork of small areas of concentrated advantage and much larger swaths of concentrated disadvantage.
It's almost like a vortex. I mean, it's these incredibly affluent, prosperous areas in urban centres sucking from the the broader extremities of those urban spaces.
It's a vortex in two ways, and you see it very clearly in Australia. You see it very clearly in the States. You feel it very clearly in the United Kingdom. You see it very clearly in Canada. there is an increasing spatial inequality between the winner cities, the Melbournes, the Sydneys, the Torontos, the Vancouvers, the Londons, the New Yorks, the San Franciscos, the LAs, and the rest of the country. And what that does is create this horrifying backlash out of which you get populism, or a euphemism for Trump. Who would have ever imagined
we know
the United
what you
States
meant.
would elect?
Yes.
It's terrifying. But you also see this phenomenon in other countries with the Brexit, with Rob Ford in Toronto. But then within the winner cities, for as much as they've so-called won, you see this what you said, this vortex of a separation of these hot areas of concentrated affluence almost cut off, as if within that city itself you have a separate nation of the affluent. And that's what the new urban crisis is really about, how we got this two dimensions of not geographic inequality between have and have not places and between have and have not neighborhoods within places.
As you point out, your latest piece in The Atlantic, which I recommend to folk, there's a paradox here in the market-based system, in the capitalist system here, that engine of growth also drives that inequality, that it's almost impossible to have one without the other.
Yeah, one of the great paradoxes of the new urban age is that if you take the most successful, the most affluent, the fastest growing, the most diverse, the most knowledge-based, the highest level of education, the densest cities, they are both at once the most unequal and the most politically liberal or politically left or politically progressive. So they may elect a Bill de Blasio, or they may elect, an Eric Garcetti in Los Angeles, or they may elect a Sadiq Khan in London. But at the same time, they're the most unequal. So you have this paradox or conundrum. The world is filled with contradictions, and that's why I say this urban contradiction is kind of a if Marx somehow came back to life, he would say it's not the factory and that's the contradiction of capitalism. It's the city itself, the city itself, which both creates wealth and spurs innovation, but carves such deep divides amongst us that it creates this backlash of populism, which threatens this very city itself. It really is, I think, the central contradiction of our age of knowledge-based capitalism, is the city as the center of innovation, but also the center of division and backlash.
Richard Florida has just described for you succinctly what he also describes at greater length in his book, The New Urban Crisis. Now, the subtitle in that book, Richard, hopefully puts it, what can we do about it? So that should be the next part of our conversation, I think. How do we push away from this? Because this is an extremely destructive thing where it feeds that separation of political class against the rest of the world, the well-to-do against the disadvantaged. Every aspect of inequality in our culture is sort of represented in our urban spaces. Can our urban spaces rearrange themselves to start to resolve some of that?
I think so, and here's why. When I first wrote the book, a fellow came to hear me give a speech in New York City. I guess if you're an American, you have to launch a book, or even a North American, you have to launch a book in New York City, so I did.
It behooves you.
And then about 2 months later or 3 months later, he heard me. I came back to New York City, and was doing something. And he said, "You've changed." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "You were so pessimistic and down about these things when I first heard you. And now you seem more optimistic." And it caused me to reflect. And I thought, well, what could have happened? Well, first, I got over the shock of Trump being elected. But in addition to that, I went to travel to all these smaller cities, Indianapolis, Milwaukee, Minneapolis, Columbus, Ohio. I could go on and list dozens of them. And everywhere I went, the local chamber of commerce, the local mayor, the local civic organizations, the labor organizations, the universities, the hospitals, the anchor corporations said to me, we had an urban revitalization. Look, and, I got to stay. Every one of these towns had a spectacular boutique hotel that looked like it could have been in New York or Melbourne or Toronto. It had a spectacular, small restaurant scene and a gastropub. It looked like a page out of my other book, Rise of the Creative Class. And what I came to understand is that was done through local hard work of local groups, local neighborhood association, local chambers of commerce, local leaders, local civic organization, local universities, all working together to say, I want to make my city better and a more creative and diverse place. And what happened, of course, is we didn't pay attention. to this mounting segmentation and mounting inequality and mounting housing unaffordability. I underpredicted it. It snuck up on the leadership of these cities. And to a person, they were saying, you know what? We were part of the solution. We're part of the problem. We're going to have to work together to solve it. So that's what I've been writing on. And I call it a shift from winner-take-all urbanism to urbanism for all. Another way of calling that is more inclusive growth or more inclusive prosperity. And I argue that it's not going to be done from a federal government. It's not going to be handed down from on high, certainly not in the United States, maybe more in Australia. It's going to be local groups, local organizations, local leadership that says, you know what? I'm a university. I'm a hospital center. I'm a big employer. I'm a civic organization. We are going to work together to upgrade low-paying service jobs, not just high-paying knowledge work. We're going to work together to find a way to build more affordable housing for our workers, workforce housing and more affordable housing for people who live here, affordable housing. We got to find a way to build better transit, not just highways. And we're going to have to do it not just a private bus to take my workers to work, but we're going to have to build a transit system that works for everyone. So I think that if we could rebuild our cities basically through the hard work of people who live in Melbourne or live in Toronto or live in Pittsburgh or live in Detroit, and it took a decade or two to do that, since I started writing Rise of the Creative Class. I think we've done the harder part. The next part, to make these places less unequal and less segregated, more egalitarian and more inclusive, I think we can do that too. And I think that, maybe my book is just a recognition that it's time to do that. And I've captured a moment when hardworking people in cities all across the country and the world are trying to do just that.
But this is in effect rebuilding our cities. I mean, we have cities now which have these thriving hearts surrounded by under-resourced dormitory urban spreads, which have none of the things that you describe as being the heartbeat of creative, supportive, nurturing environments.
And our anchor institutions, let's list them: universities, medical centers, the things that anchor, and they said were important to building the clusters and building new high-tech industries. Our big companies, big tech companies all throughout the world that are so important to revitalizing cities and wanted to move back downtown to get access to amenities and restaurants and a great talent pool. Real estate developers that have profited a lot from this. It's time to buck up. It's not like a federal solution is going to come anymore. That we're going to have to do this together. And what I just wrote a piece at The Atlantic, which said these anchor institutions have to get with the program of inclusive prosperity. And what I've heard going around the United States and Canada, and hopefully be back in Australia sometime soon, but I heard it going around North America, is that the heads of these anchor institutions are now saying, we did bring back our cities. We were part of the urban solution. But in doing so, we created that enclave of affluence surrounded by that desert of despair. We've got to do something that's more inclusive. We've got to upgrade the jobs, the people who are working in our cafeterias and gymnasiums and healthcare centers and offices and clerical work. We've got to make those better jobs and create a middle class. We can't just pay our knowledge workers a lot so they can buy housing nearby. We're going to have to develop some more affordable housing for our workforce. We're going to have to better the communities we're in. So what I'm hearing, which is amazing, I thought this would fall on deaf ears, but what I'm hearing all around this country and North America is people are ready for it. And I have a feeling people in Melbourne and people in Australia, if that's the case in North America, are probably more ready for it. And here's the thing. I think my creative class came back to cities because they wanted a diverse, exciting, socioeconomically, racially, and ethnically mixed community. They didn't come back to the cities to be in the equivalent of a boring suburb with the same old crappy retail shops that looks like a mall. And I also think this group is feeling pretty guilty. I think there's a lot of guilt on the part of all of us that said we wanted to be part of a more diverse city, but our actions, by default, helped drive the housing prices up that made the city less diverse. So I think there's a reservoir of guilt and both activism that it's by no means a foregone conclusion that this will happen. But I think there's a moment in which we can change the narrative and change the conversation to build more inclusive and better cities for everybody.
Well, I think building a better city is perhaps a better solution than electing demagogues, and both might be aimed at the same issues. Richard, thank you. That is a call to arms. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much. And I hope to see you in person in the not too very distant future. Thanks for having me.
We will make it so. Richard Florida is author of The New Urban Crisis. He is many things. He's Professor, Director of Cities at the University of Toronto. He's the co-founder of City Lab, Senior Editor at The Atlantic. Yes, in that book, The New Urban Crisis, long subtitle, look for it in books. Richard, Florida is your man. A blueprint for living, right here on RN.